All right, everybody, welcome back to another episode of Hawk Droppings. I'm your host, Hawk, and I've got a guest tonight who I've wanted to have on for an interview for quite some time, a guy named Will Westmoreland, who I was lucky enough to find on TikTok, who, I like to describe as an elections expert. So why don't we start with, Will, why don't you just tell everybody who you are, what you do, and what your experience is?
Sure. Since TikTok is a great place to just declare your brilliance, I kind of coined myself the, your favorite rural election campaign and elections expert. But all kidding aside, I've got about 33 years of experience in politics. So a lot of that is as a political consultant. Some of that was serving as officers, different roles inside the Democratic Party. But I started in 1992 as a field director for Clinton-Gore in the state of Ohio. I was born here in Missouri, got hooked on politics because of a teacher that, believe it or not, a home economics teacher, took us on a field trip to our state capital when I was in 8th grade, and I just got hooked on politics. I don't know what it was, but I was addicted to it. I've been addicted to it ever since. But my first paid job was in Franklin County, Ohio, Columbus, working for the Clinton-Gore campaign. And basically my role on that campaign, this tells you how much things have changed over the years. Columbus is now the bluest city in Ohio. You know that because you're from there. Franklin County is one of the bluest counties. But back when you and I, in our younger days, the idea was that you narrowed the vote in Franklin County, Ohio, where Columbus is. You didn't let the Republicans win by more than 120,000. And if you could just do that, then Cleveland and Toledo and all these other big blue cities like Youngstown, they would overwhelm that vote and you could win the state of Ohio. And that's what we did. We won the primary to put Clinton over the top in terms of becoming the nominee. And then in the general election on election night, the state went for Clinton and made him president. Since then, I worked on the national healthcare campaign for Clinton. I've run as a campaign manager, U.S. Senate race, multiple state, House races, Senate races, probably the subject of another podcast, but I got America's toughest sheriff run out of office and arrested. And when I lived in North Carolina, corrupt sheriff. That's a great story for another day. But, I've just been buried in this stuff for a long time. And I still do it today. I'm a farmer. I have an agroforestry company. But my main company is I do political consulting. So what that means is I do all kinds of voter outreach, texting, phone calls, focus groups.
Wait, are you the guy who's texting me 30 times a day?
30 times a day, and then I love to call you right when you sit down for dinner. That's me. That's me. Yeah.
All right. Yeah. And that's why I wanted to have you on. I mean, it's like you've been doing the nuts and bolts on the ground kind of stuff for these kinds of campaigns. For over 30 years. And
as my brother says, more nuts than bolts, probably. But
yeah, no doubt.
Yeah.
And we were talking a little bit before we went live. I think most people whose IQ is above room temperature are scared to death about this election and how close it is and things like this. And as you said, TikTok is the perfect place where you can just get on and declare yourself an expert in whatever.
Right.
And I've got the whole gamut of people on my For You page. And I mean, I saw a guy the other day, he was doing a TikTok live and he had a map of the United States behind him and every state was blue. And he was talking about how Kamala was going to win all 50 states.
Yeah.
And I'm just like, dude, you're not helping.
No, that's called delusion. It's just called blue delusion instead of red delusion.
Yeah.
So,
but so let's start with this. I'm going to save that other part. So we're recording this on the evening of Monday, October 28th. Election day is a week from tomorrow.
Yeah.
People are already voting all across the country. Millions and millions of votes have already been cast. A lot of states have had record turnout for early voting. And, well, I'll start it. I want to talk about what people should expect to
Yeah.
know and not know on election day and election night. But part of what I want to come back to part of what you and I were discussing beforehand in the changes in how people are voting now in
Right.
2024 versus 2020. Why don't you hit on that stuff a little bit?
Yeah, I think what's driving most of the angst out there and has people so upset, and I fall into this first category, is we all want to believe that we don't live in a country that could be evenly divided between what Harris represents and what Trump represents. And as a population as a whole, we're not evenly divided. Only about 39-40% of the population supports the MAGA point of view. But unfortunately, from a registered voter perspective, we are evenly divided. And we can't change that with hopes and dreams, unfortunately. That's the reality of the voting electorate in this election, just like it was last time and in 2016. So I always tell people it's a good thing that we're disgusted, with the fact that half of this country thinks that what Donald Trump represents is okay, but we live in that kind of country. So I always kind of give you a virtual high five or thumbs up whenever I see you come on in a video and say that, this is the world we live in, because you certainly can't defeat it. You can't fight it and defeat it if you're Pollyanna about it, right? You have to recognize that it exists. So that's number one. The biggest thing that I see, though, we were talking a little bit about this before we got started, is the way this election is going to play out is much different than 2020. And I don't know if you can insert things after the podcast, but I've got a chart I can send you that just kind of shows the growth of early voting. Your brother maybe can do it, Hawk. Sorry.
Yeah, Falcon may know how to do it. Send it to me. I'll make sure you have my email address. Yeah. You can send it to me. We'll see what kind of magic my brother can work.
I saw the chuckle, and I too would have the same look on my face as you said that to me. But no, but to my point is that early voting, in the numbers that we've seen, it is really a relatively new phenomenon. So in 1992, about 7% of Americans voted early. Okay. Then in the next election in 2000, that climbed up to about 16%. And then I think it was the 2008 election that it kind of climbed up into that 30% range that's normal, quote unquote. So in 2012, it was a little bit higher at like 32%. And then in 2016, it went up to like 36%. So it kind of looks like the normal range of early voting in this country is somewhere like around 32 to 36%, okay? Then COVID came along, and you saw this huge increase to 64.04% in early voting. It was a complete anomaly, okay? Because just like everything else with Trump, voting became a culture war issue, right? Mm-hmm. So if you were a Democrat, what did you do? You got your vaccination and you voted early because you wanted to create a safer environment for your fellow Americans. If you were a Republican, even though Republicans historically, since the beginning of time, since we've had early voting, have voted early more often than Democrats, Trump changed that because he said, you're not a real American if you vote early. So they voted on election day. So you had, and you've talked about it many times, you had this surge of early voting where we built this big blue firewall. And then on election day, the red tsunami comes. And the question is just simply, is it enough to overwhelm the firewall that we've put in place? This election is going to be a lot different for three reasons. And I have a tendency to just have verbal diarrhea, so you stop me if you have any questions. But
I'm making notes so I can follow up.
Okay. Number one, we're not going to see the level of early voting this time around that we saw in 2020. We've already seen that, right? So just to give you an example, I wrote one example down before we came on here. In Pennsylvania in 2020, 2,629,672 people voted early. Okay. The mix, Democrat to Republican and Independent, was 64.7% Democrat, 23.7% Republican, and 10.8% Independent. Now, this time around in 2024, only 1.973 million people have even requested a ballot. So you've got a drop of 700,000 voters just between the number of people that turned theirs in and the number of overall people that requested. So far, only 1,281,847 have voted early, have turned their ballots in. That mix, remember what I said, 65 Democrat, 23 or 24 Republican, 11% independent. This time around, the mix is 60% Democrat. That's a 5-point decrease. 30.4% Republican. That's a 7% increase. And 10.8% independent. That's roughly the same, right?
Yeah.
So to my point earlier, you're seeing fewer Democrats vote earlier. You're seeing a lot more Republicans vote earlier. Now, what I just tell everybody when I say calm down, there's not some magical new pool of Republican voters out there that are just voting early. What this means is, since we've got a larger group of Republicans voting early, that means there's going to be a smaller group compared to last time that vote on election day. Mm-hmm. So this election is going to look a lot different. You're still going to have a little bit of a Democratic firewall in states like Pennsylvania, but it's not going to need to be as big as it was in 2020 because you're going to have a lot more Democrats voting on election day to water down that Republican vote. So just visually, it's going to look a lot different. And if you open up these websites and you look at early voting, and every time you see that Democratic voting is 50% of what it was in 2020, or Republicans are outvoting in early voting in Georgia and North Carolina, you're going to need a straitjacket by election day because you don't know all the rest of the data that goes along with that would give you a calm soul. So that's the problem I see right now.
And I'm glad you spoke about Pennsylvania.
Yeah.
And tell me if I'm wrong, but it's kind of been my feeling that whoever wins Pennsylvania is going to win the election. Kamala Harris is concentrating a lot of her efforts on that kind of Great Lakes blue wall of Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania. Yeah. And Donald Trump is focusing on Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and Georgia. The one that overlaps between the two is Pennsylvania. And all of that information you just gave was very helpful because I remember what we went through in 2020, specifically with Pennsylvania, because Republicans in the state legislature have set up their rules that they can't count mail-in ballots, early vote ballots before Election Day.
That's right.
Or it's like before Election Day or before all of the in-person votes have been counted. I can't remember which.
You actually have to count all the in-person votes before you can open and count the early vote. That's 100% correct. So
which is what created that red mirage, right?
And Hawk, can I just say something? I know you know this, but that was done 100% on purpose.
Exactly.
People need to understand this. This wasn't just a fate. This wasn't a twist of fate. It wasn't an accident. The Republicans had this planned all along. They intentionally, in 3 different Rust Belt states, these swing states, they voted in their state legislatures to make it so that in some version or another, you had to count the early vote later than you counted the election day vote, because they knew exactly what was going to happen since Trump had made this a culture war issue, and they knew that the vast majority of Republicans were going to vote on election day. What better scenario to claim there was a steal? My God, he was leading by 400,000 votes on election day, and all of a sudden they found 700,000 votes.
Yeah. I just remember that audio of Trump saying, do you remember that dump, that big, massive dump in Pennsylvania overnight, that big, fat dump?
Only dump being taken in Pennsylvania on election night is when his team saw that they didn't have enough votes coming in to overwhelm the firewall. That was the only dump. That was his campaign manager shitting himself on election night.
Well, So I wanted to go through all of that kind of as preamble for, what can we expect to know on election night? And it sounds like Pennsylvania election results in 2024, that timeline, how they're made up, that breakdown is going to be dramatically different than it was in 2020.
I think we're actually going to know a little bit earlier. I don't want to be so bold as to say we're going to know on election day. But here's the thing. The way you can kind of get a general idea of what the firewall is from the early vote is we know that 97% of Democrats have said in polling that they're going to vote for Harris. 94% of Republicans are saying they're going to vote for Trump. That's pretty close to, you take the early vote number that's Democrat, and it pretty much is going to match, what we see in the early voting. So when we get down to the day before the election and we've looked at the total early vote, okay, right now it looks like we're going to have a 400 to 450,000 vote firewall in Pennsylvania. Okay. But if you do the
Yeah.
math, we're only early voting at about half the number. That means that those Democrats that normally would have voted early, they're going to show up on election day. So there's going to be less of a chance that you're going to get the red tsunami that you need to overwhelm that firewall. So it'll be late, but I think around midnight, 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock in the morning, we'll start to see pretty decisively in Pennsylvania where the trend is going, especially if Karnacki tells us where the vote's coming from.
Yeah.
You know, so which that guy, don't get me started lately. I talk about wanting to make the election close.
All of those guys, it's like I pay attention to them on election night when the votes are coming in. Prior to election day, I just tune them all out. I mean, and it's like CNN is trying to have their own Steve Kornacki with this Harry Enton guy. And it's like, you know, one day he's like, Kamala has no path to victory. And then 4 days later, he's like, she's got this in the bag. And 4 days after that, he's like, Trump's going to win. And I'm just like, dude, man.
Here's the problem. These are TV personalities that have specialized in election coverage. They don't, like, I'm going to give you a perfect example. The other day, what did Karnacki do? He came out and he freaked out on live TV, had everybody I know scared to death because he said that the white Gen Z vote is leaning 13% Trump in the polling, which is true. There's a 53% gap between Gen Z women and Gen Z men. But then he goes on to say, oh my God, it's eating away a third of the lead that Harris has with Gen Z women. What he didn't say, because he doesn't know how this works, is we've polled Gen Z men and only 68% of them say they're going to vote. And in that 68% that say they're going to vote, the race is dead even. So it's not taking away from her Gen Z. Yeah, it's not taking away from her Gen Z. But well, you got to think you're a little bit more enlightened male if you're going to vote for Harris in that age group, right? Because if you're listening to Rogan and Paul and all these other dipshits that tell you masculinity is all about conquest, you got to think you're a little bit enlightened to reach the conclusion that you're going to vote for Harris. But yeah, amongst the Gen Z men that are voting in that 68%, it's exactly split down the middle. So it's not eating away from her Gen Z female.
Wow.
Vote. He doesn't know that because he doesn't do what I do. Just like I don't know how you get a great shot on a TV camera, you know?
I got to think that, and I mean, I'm just supposing this, but I got to think if you're a Gen Z man and you voted for Trump and you're also trying to find a wife and you voted for somebody you voted for somebody, you know, who's taking this young woman's rights away from her, you're going to have a rough time.
I'm telling you, my daughter is 34 years old. I was a single dad. I raised all 4 of my kids, and I didn't know any better than to just raise her like my sons. I had 3 sons and a daughter. And I will tell you, beyond a shadow of a doubt, she would never marry a MAGA male. Ever.
Yeah.
Ever.
Yeah. So let me ask you this. So, like, one thing that has been kind of confusing to me, I think it's kind of novel, I guess. I mean, I think Donald Trump understands, certainly his people do in the campaign. Yeah. They understand there's an absolutely massive gender gap. That women of all age groups are breaking massively towards Kamala Harris because of the Dobbs decision overturning Roe versus Wade. And Trump is like pinning his hopes on these low propensity, unreliable voters like men under 30, the podcast bro crowd. Yeah. I mean, what do you think of that as a strategy?
I think they're making a couple of big mistakes. I think number one, they're assuming, and a lot of Democrats that are scared are assuming, you got to remember in this early vote, a lot of it is women over the age of 65. And the polling shows, at least up to about 3 weeks ago when I looked at it, that demographic is not skewing Republican anymore. It's actually 2% Harris. So in a lot of this early vote, it's leaning women and it's leaning a little bit, you know, Harris. Then you get down into the younger demographics and it's all Harris other than the white males that we talked about. So yeah, I think it's a critical mistake. I think the 3 big mistakes that they have made in this election cycle is I'm stating the obvious here, but we're changing as a society. Just like all democracies and all governments around the world, all countries around the world, we're becoming more and more a population of color. And that's just something that if you're a white person, you can either let that be a source of fear and anger, or you can jump on the POC train and realize that our country is probably one of the best in the world and incorporating people into our way of doing things if we accept them with open arms. So I think all this stuff that you saw in New York, and there's no way, I mean, I'm just going to tell you, it's bullshit that they didn't see those speeches in advance. I've worked on presidential campaigns. You don't just show up with your speech and say, hey, teleprompter guy, put this in. You have to get that shit to them a week at least in advance. They do changes. You make your changes back to them. It's all loaded in advance. They went in there knowing exactly what everybody was going to say. So
yeah, interesting thing on that. I mean, because when that comedian, Tony Hinchcliffe, I started seeing clips. I watched 2.5 hours of that rally yesterday. I missed him. Yeah. He was super early in the lineup. But when I started seeing clips of his quote unquote jokes, I know that I'm not super familiar with him. I know that he's a regular guest on the Joe Rogan podcast. He's in that stand-up comedy crowd that Rogan runs with. That he has his own weekly podcast show, Tony Hinchcliffe does. And I was like, I'm just wondering if this was like some kind of trolling thing that he did, like some kind of Andy Kaufman performance art sort of thing. Because the other alternative is that he's just really fucking racist.
Well, I do think it falls into the first category to your point. I do.
Then I saw reporting this morning that he went after Tim Walz on Twitter for criticizing him and his jokes. And then Mark Caputo, reporter for The Bulwark, he put up an article saying, I've spoken with 4 people very high up in the Trump campaign that said they saw his script.
Yes.
They saw all of his jokes ahead of time, and there was one joke that they asked him to remove, which he did. He agreed to, and it was a joke where he was going to explicitly call Kamala Harris the C word.
Yeah,
he took that one
really
out.
high bar, huh?
That was their line.
Really high bar.
They looked at his script, and all of the other jokes were fine.
Yeah. Well, he falls into this group of comedians that doesn't believe there should be a line. So I will say that about him is that he falls into this Elon Musk category. Sometimes Bill Maher ends up there where they say you ought to be able to say or do anything you want to do in comedy. The problem is
they want to be able to say whatever they want without any social pushback whatsoever.
That's where I was going to go with that.
It's not realistic.
But and we don't want to hear that in our politics.
Right. Yeah.
Some people do, but we call them MAGA,
Well, so you mentioned that we're becoming a society with more Black Americans, more people of color, and interestingly, I did learn within the last week from watching several Black creators on TikTok that they don't like to be lumped in with that phrase "people of color," persons of color, which
this is true.
That was very interesting to me. But it's like I've had to explain it a couple of times because I've dropped the year 2042 as why we're kind of in the last gasps of white supremacy in this country, because it's projected that in the year 2042 white people will become a minority in the United States of America. That's right. And I mean, have you ever had any experience at all in your 32 years of seeing any campaign being run so explicitly racist, bigoted, misogynistic, transphobic, authoritarianism, preaching vengeance, punishment, retribution, that kind of stuff? Have you ever seen anything like this?
No, we've had racially tinted campaigns. Obviously, we had some campaigns with Wallace. He was very clearly fell into the racism category. And then Republicans have always used shadows of racism in their campaigns. You're old enough to remember, as am I, the Willie Horton ads.
Dude, I remember when Pat Buchanan was running for president.
Right, I do too, and I wasn't a kid.
Yeah, I think I was in college.
yeah, and we know what they did to John McCain. He had adopted a daughter from either India or Sri Lanka, and the Bush campaign dumped that ad in there saying that he'd had an affair with an African American woman. They did it to Bill Clinton, that he had an illegitimate black child in Arkansas. So the Republican Party, the whole Republican Party today is built on the Southern strategy. So yes, I've seen nuances of it. Like I said, I'm not a Pollyanna. I've seen nuances of it. Have I ever seen anything that's this in your face and combines elements of fascism and retribution from a government perspective? Hell no, man. I've never seen anything that even comes close to this, ever.
So, all right. So let's get down to it here. One of the most horrifying things for me, and friends of mine who are black and who are people of color in the LGBTQ community, when I say things to them, I'm like, God, I can't believe that there are so many people in this country that are this racist. They just point at me and laugh.
Same.
They're like, where you been for the last 400 years, dude?
Yeah. My buddy tells me, Will, it's great to be white, buddy. It's great to be white,
Well, and I very frequently acknowledge in my podcasts and on my TikTok page, it's like, I'm a heterosexual, cisgendered white man in the United States of America. I'm not married. I don't have any kids. I have a law degree. I have every privilege that this country affords except for generational wealth. I get that.
Yeah.
And I don't always understand what they are, but I understand that, growing up the way that I did and existing in this world the way that I do, I have a lot of blind spots to things. But it's like, are there really enough voters in this country who are going to support this kind of a campaign towards racist, misogynistic, transphobic authoritarianism?
First of all, I was just sitting here thinking I should have prefaced that my friend who always tells me it's great to be white is African American, because the way I said it puts a whole different context on it.
Yes, it does. That's a solid clarification
Hawk
there.
Hawk is freaking out. He's like, "Oh shit, where's this going to go?"
I assumed it, but I'm glad that you actually said it.
Yeah, no, I'm smart enough to know when I put my foot in my mouth. So what MAGA does, and I've seen, you've made videos about this, Hawk, so I'm stating the obvious here. What MAGA does, there's this huge segment of MAGA that they would never agree that that's okay, but they make excuses for it. They say it's not real. That's Trump being Trump. He really doesn't mean what he says. He's just trying to rile up the left. He's trying to get voter turnout up there. But here's the thing. This is a dirty little secret in my industry, and my best friend is an attorney, so I know it's a dirty little secret in your industry as well. We all hang out together. We have beers together. Opposing counsel has beers together. Opposing political consultants, we have beer together. I've talked to some of the guys that are at Chris LaCivita's level. He's Trump's campaign manager. I've never met Chris, but I've talked to people at that level, and I'm telling you, Trump really is that shitty, and they'll tell you that. They'll tell you that's part of the plan. The way they talk about their base is unbelievable. The things that you say in your lives pale in comparison to the way these Republican political consultants talk about MAGA. And I know there are going to be a lot of people on the other side that watch this, and they're going to say, bullshit, that's not true. Granted, you don't know me from anybody else, but I'm telling you, the way they talk about their own people, it makes what you say in your lives look like a celebration of MAGA.
Well, it's like, and I've said this to some of those people. I'm like, do you think when I'm on somebody else's live and they bring up a Trump supporter, and I just ask him, I'm like, you think Trump would ever let you inside the gate at Mar-a-Lago? Do you think
No,
in a million years that would happen? That he
no.
would ever play around a golf with somebody like you?
Yeah.
That he would ever shake your hand? He doesn't touch his supporters.
No.
He doesn't do what we've seen so many supporters do, where it's like they walk the rope, man, and they're shaking hands and they're kissing babies and they're
Yeah.
touching people. Trump has never done
Yeah.
that. He thinks that his own supporters are physically disgusting human beings.
He's a germaphobe. I mean, and I know some people have, they have psychological issues that cause that, but he's disgusted by his own supporters. I'm just telling you, I know people who have worked with him,
Yeah.
who have heard from his lips comments about his own supporters that would make them cringe.
And these people go to work and they earn
Yeah.
money and they send that
Yeah.
money to him so that he can
Yeah.
pay his legal bills.
Yeah.
It's
I was just in a
unbelievable to me.
store the other day and saw my first pair of gold high top Trump basketball shoes.
Wow, man.
And let me just say this: the guy wearing it was exactly who you would expect to see wear. He was the poster child.
He probably was the same kind of asshole that voted in person in 2020 and showed up at the polling
Yeah.
place,
Yeah.
refusing to wear a mask and had not been vaccinated.
And he's the
Fake-
guy that when you lose your best friend to COVID, he says, "Well, did he have other health problems?"
Right. Well, did he die
I can't
with
tell you
COVID?
how many times? Yeah.
They're like, well, did he die with COVID or from COVID? You're
Yeah.
just like, fuck you,
Yeah.
dude.
Yeah. Yeah. The old country boy in me would come out. I
Man.
lost many, many good friends
Yeah.
to COVID, including my brother-in-law, who was like a real brother to me. And I don't want to go into too much detail about it because I don't want to, but it was a situation where wouldn't get it because he was worried about it. The people around him were filling his ear, totally preventable, So I have a real chip on my shoulder about that stuff.
I bet. I mean, I lost a couple friends of mine who are still back in Ohio.
Yeah.
Same thing, people that I knew growing up or people who I'd been in bands with when I was going to Ohio State in the early 90s. It's just tragic shit. And it's like, it just seems like I heard somebody say the other day that the United States has 4% of the world's population and we had 16% of the world's COVID deaths.
Yes.
In the United States,
Yeah.
where we had a vaccine faster than anybody else on the planet.
Yeah. And there have actually been, the polling world is a really crass world. It's like there isn't anything we won't look at. And by an overwhelming percentage, more MAGA-leaning Republicans after the vaccination came out, more MAGA-leaning Republicans passed away from that disease than any other category. And it didn't have to happen.
I'll bet you guys are like actuaries for insurance companies.
Yeah. It's just,
man.
I know I'm preaching to the choir, but no, I've never, to answer the broader question, I've never seen anything like this in 33 years. And you may have been on a live when I brought this up, but literally, Hawk, 2.5 months ago, I got a call from a really large political firm in one of the eastern states that I've worked with many times in the past. And the guy said, "Will, we're putting together a group of people to look at dual citizenship in Canada and in the United Kingdom because of his threats to put, like, this isn't me tooting my own horn, but like I did all of the voter outreach for Warnock and Ossoff down in Georgia, like all the texting, all the phone calls. I'm probably not at the top of that list, but I'm probably on the front.
Nice work.
Yeah.
Good work.
So, but my point is, they're like, when he says he wants to put people in jail, he's not just talking about the Nancy Pelosi's he's talking about guys like me and guys like you, because you've got a huge following on TikTok. I'm a lawyer. Exactly.
And I'm a lawyer.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But in what world in this country would I have ever thought I'd be having a conversation about, do I want dual citizenship? So if I need to leave the country, I told him, hey, I'm an older guy, so they can have my country when they pry it from my cold dead hands. But thanks for calling.
Yeah. Yeah, man. All right, so let's switch gears a little bit.
Yeah.
I, I mean, people on the left on TikTok, um, I think, are people who are a bit more educated than your average American. I think they're paying quite a bit more attention to all of this election stuff than your average American. And I get so many of them in my comments on my videos every single day saying all the polls are wrong. I don't trust
Yeah.
any of the polls, and on and on and on and on and on. And they always bring up 2016, uh, and it's like, and you tell me if I get any of this wrong. It's like, so I spent a lot of time reading about the 2016 election and the polling and how late breaking voters within the last 14 to 10 days broke heavily in favor of Donald Trump, such that, you know, the polling in the 2016 election ended up being off by a little more than 2 points. And
And guess what the
historically,
margin of error was?
yeah, and historically, polling is within a point or two,
That's right.
you know, and for decades. And I'm just saying to people, it's like, you can't just ignore and if anything, since
Yeah.
2016, polling has improved, because I think they've figured out some way
Yes.
to deal with Trump having been underrepresented in the polling
They
in
have. I could
2016 and
speak to that.
2020.
Yeah.
There you go. And so I'm just like, you can't just stick your fingers in your ears and go la 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 la. Every single poll is wrong.
Yeah.
So talk to me a little bit about that.
So 2016, there is sometimes I forget we're not on TikTok. This is your podcast because I
Yeah,
don't want to poke the bear, but there's a really large
poke
creator.
away, man.
There's a really large creator on TikTok that I have nothing in the world against her, but she has made her name on TikTok telling people, don't worry, it's going to be a blowout. Everything is going to be okay. And I've actually been on one of her lives, and I think she's a really smart person. But the problem is the first question I always ask somebody when they say, look at the 2016 polls, the first question I ask is, were they within the margin of error? Well, yes, they were, but it's like there's no
Bingo.
but. They were within the margin of error. And to your point, we've made some really critical changes. So we figured out in 2016, in the past, we'd always been able to look at white men and white women as this monolithic voting group. They kind of went together, right? What we realized after Trump got elected in 2016 is there's this huge chasm between white men and women with college educations and white men and women with high school educations. And I'm not blasting anybody's education. I'm just telling you, the more educated you are, the more likely you are to be centrist to left, and the more likely you are to vote for a Democratic or left-leaning candidate. So we fixed that in the weighting of how we weight voters, and we divided up our models in 2022 or in 2020 and said, okay, we're going to question college educated women and men in a different pool than how we question high school educated women and men. And it was a lot better. It was within the margin of error, but it was a lot closer. We tweaked it a little bit more in 22. And without a doubt, 2022 was the most accurate polling we've ever had in the history of this country. And I have yet to hear a valid argument other than just feelings. And we can't criticize the Republicans for thinking feelings are facts and then turn around and do it ourselves. I have yet to hear a valid argument that the polling it's wrong. And I get there is one argument that people use that I understand, and there are a lot of us that do polling that would like to see this change, and that is we don't ask the questions of the exact same group of people each time. So our sample of 900 and whatever, we may call that sample in Ohio and Oklahoma one time, California and Nevada the next time. But the reason we do that is because we're worried that if we call the same group every time, they'll get married into their stance. So even if they change their mind, they want to answer the same way to the pollster who's calling them back. They don't want to look stupid. They don't want to admit they changed their mind. So will they marry themselves in? But yeah, to your point, I mean, just simply put, polling was the most accurate it's ever been in 2022. And I've yet to hear a cogent argument laid out by the other side, to tell me why that is an incorrect statement or that we're getting it wrong. We give ourselves a 6 to 8 point leeway for the love of God. It's hard to get it wrong when you give yourself a 3% margin of error means that if we're showing Harris up by 1, that means she could be trailing by 2 or she could be winning by 4. So it's pretty hard unless you're just a really bad data scientist to screw that up.
Well, so let me ask you this. And I know, well, I shouldn't say I know. I think this is a relatively recent phenomenon of all of these kind of like garbage polls on the right sort of flooding the zone with shit and messing up averages. And was that, like you said, the 2022 polling was the most accurate that we've had up to this point. Were those garbage bullshit right-wing polls the reason why all the Republicans were talking about a red wave in 22?
That was actually 100% media driven. None of the polls, I don't want to say none, but if you look at the polling in 2022, there was not any accurate, the best pollsters have a 3.0 rating on 538. I would say none of the top 50 pollsters had any kind of red wave ever appearing in the numbers, in their polling numbers. That was 100% driven by the media saying, well, the economy is bad, inflation is up, therefore people are going to strike out against the sitting presidency. And normally that happens in an off election year. What they didn't understand is how important the choice issue was going to be to people. And that choice issue totally overwhelmed, any angst that people had about the economy in the middle and on the left.
Okay, so, well, let's talk about that. I mean, obviously the issue of abortion has become an issue again. With the Dobbs decision that came out in May of 2022, overturning Roe versus Wade. And we've talked about realignments and who's voting for who and realignments and how people are voting. How much of a realignment has taken place that you can attribute to the Dobbs decision overturning Roe versus Wade, especially now that we're hearing, I mean, that's been the law now for 2 years or more. And we're starting to hear these absolutely horrific stories of the things that women and girls are going through. It's
really hitting home
impact?
Yeah.
So
I'm sorry, got a little bit of a delay.
Go ahead.
The biggest impact is just where you would expect it to be, and that's going to be among women. Okay, so I'm always wary when I say this because I don't want to upset women, because if the women in your life are happy, life is just a lot more enjoyable. So sometimes some of my lady friends get a little bit upset with me when I say this, but it's just the truth. When you poll women, reproductive rights and abortion are the number one issue by far. And that's going to drive, and it's already driving, this high early vote number among women, and it's driving the fact that the women's vote is going so overwhelmingly toward Democrat. Now, the truth of the matter is, and you could say the sad truth is, when you throw everybody else into the equation, abortion and reproductive rights fall out of the top 3. It's the economy, it's inflation, and believe it or not, as much as it sickens me to say this, the border. And so I say all that, and I stress to people, we can't go out there as a party in our approach to voters and be monolithic on one issue. When we're talking to women and when we're talking to college-educated men, that reproductive rights issue, bodily autonomy, and abortion is going to get you a long way. When you're talking to a young Gen Z male, it's not going to get you anywhere. So we have to have these different approaches to different voting blocks. Now, to our credit, that's something Trump doesn't do very well at all. What you saw yesterday is basically their pitch, But yeah,
Jesus
when you include
Christ,
everybody
man.
in the numbers, when you include everybody in the numbers, that falls down a little bit.
I mean, to describe that Madison Square Garden rally as Trump's like closing argument, his final pitch to the United States, that's fucking terrifying. Let me ask you about this. Well, so I've read a lot about get out the vote efforts.
Yeah.
And I know that Kamala Harris's campaign has been very public. They've signed up like 500,000 plus volunteers. I'm seeing people on TikTok that are out knocking on doors, doing TikToks while they're doing that work and talking to voters and making sure that they're getting their ballots turned in or they have a plan for election day. And something I've also talked about a lot. It's like when Donald Trump became the nominee, he took over the RNC, he took all their money, he moved their data operations and their fundraising operations down to West Palm.
Sounds like a familiar pattern, eh?
Yeah, he fired everybody. Yeah. He put his daughter-in-law, Laura Trump, in charge. And so now the RNC has no money for down ballot races. They have no money for get out the vote. And then Charlie Kirk from Turning Points comes in and pitches all these Republican billionaires about, I'm going to do the get out the vote effort. That didn't work. So he turned it over to Elon Musk. And now there's been a whole bunch of like fraudulent door knocking going on.
Yeah, I think the black suburbians are going to be showing up at Elon's house after the election. You know, but there's a part of me that's like, why in the fuck aren't they there right now? You know?
Yeah. So how big of a factor is, the actual get out the vote ground game?
Yeah. It's huge.
Like how bad is it going to hurt Trump that he effectively doesn't have one? And Kamala seems to be pervasive, effective, repetitive, and everywhere in the swing states. How big of a difference is that going to make?
It's going to be huge. And let me give you an example because my firm does a lot of get out the vote. We call it GOTV, okay? Mm-hmm. And I'll just give you an example of some of the things that we're doing right now. First of all, we do canvassing. So not only are there a lot of good people volunteering from the election, like you talked about, so people that just support Harris are out there knocking on doors, et cetera, but we'll go into a city, let's use a good swing city like Charlotte or Raleigh, North Carolina. We'll go into a city like that as a team and we'll recruit 1,000 people to go out as paid workers to knock on doors and do canvassing. So on top of all the volunteers that are out there doing this work, she's got millions and millions of dollars to put into paid GOTV, get out the vote. Mm-hmm. And it's really organized. Like, for instance, without going into too much of our secret sauce here, at the beginning of last week, I may or may not have gotten a list of everybody in a certain state that had requested an absentee ballot but hadn't turned it in yet. And every day I may text those people and I may call them and say, turn your ballot in. Then the next day I may get a refresh list where everybody who voted the day before is gone. And I'm now just calling the people that are left on that list. That's how scientific it is on the Harris side. Whereas with the Trump people, they're not doing that stuff unless it's happening. It is happening in some states that have good local Republican state parties, et cetera. But they're having to fund it all out of their own, state parties, et cetera. So it's critical because, as much as we want to think that all of our politics is volunteer driven, the vast majority of GOTV is going to be paid GOTV, text messages, live phone calls, door-to-door canvassing, and all these other things. And she's got millions of more dollars to do that with than he does.
Yeah. So, all right. In these last few minutes, do you do predictions?
I don't mind giving you my prediction. Sure, why not? Hell.
All right, we'll start easy here. I'll tell you mine. You tell me if I'm right or not.
Okay.
In the Senate in Ohio, Sherrod Brown's going to win.
I agree.
And I don't know if you've ever heard me say this. My grandmother on my mom's side and Sherrod Brown's mom were best friends for 50 years.
No, that's really cool. I've only met him one time, but I really like him.
So my mom used to babysit him when he was a little kid.
That's crazy, man. That's crazy.
It must have been sometime in the 80s when Sherrod was Secretary of State for Ohio. And Frank Zappa came to Columbus and played like Vets Memorial or something. And he used to register people to vote at all of his gigs.
That doesn't surprise me
And
at all.
so my mom and my brother and I we met Sherrod Brown and had dinner with him and Frank Zappa, and then we got to go to the show when we were little kids. That's my Sherrod Brown story.
That's a cool story, though, man.
It is. It's a good story.
Yeah.
Sticking with Senate races, Montana, John Tester's going to lose.
Okay, so I'm gonna give you my heart
even though Tim Sheehy is a historically shitty candidate and a liar on everything.
I'm gonna give you my heart answer, and I'm gonna give you my gut answer. My gut answer is he's gonna lose. My hard answer is he's my favorite U.S. senator for so many different reasons. You know, and he always finds a way to win. And a poll just came out today where he's closed that race from 6 down to 3. So I'm just going to say, don't ever write him off. But unfortunately, I think he loses. And God, I hope I have to eat crow on that the day after the election.
No doubt, man.
Yeah.
Florida, Debbie McCarcel-Powell, does she have a shot against Rick Scott for the Senate?
She does have a shot. Based on what I'm seeing in early voting, I don't think she's going to win. Very borderline on that one. I want to be honest.
Yeah. Okay.
You're saying pick a side. So
no, I hear you, man.
Yeah.
Well, I'll do the same thing on this one. Texas. My heart thinks that Colin Allred has a chance to beat Fat Wolverine, Ted Cruz.
Go with your heart. Because
you think he can pull it out?
Tells me that. Yeah, I've seen a whole lot of Republican. The father of the Marine that was held in Russia for years came out about a month ago and endorsed Colin Allred and gave one of the most impassioned pleas that I've ever seen, saying that Colin is the guy that every day picked up the phone and fought to get our son out. I think he's going to win.
I saw that ad.
Yeah.
I saw that ad. That was a good ad.
And I got to tell you, like, full disclosure, Texas is my largest market. I've got more political candidates in Houston than any other city that I do work in, and I am hearing a lot of good things down there.
Okay, so with one of the voter suppression laws, I'll just characterize it like that, that Republicans passed in Texas, the state legislature, following the 2020 election, that specifically targets that county where Houston is located.
Yes.
What kind of shenanigans are we going to see this year in that county and in the state of Texas?
Well, what they did is they basically took the election out of the hands of the local elections people that had run it forever, and they put it in the hands of a state entity. But I've got to tell you, this is one of those things, like when people tell me they're going to try to not certify the election, I always say, yeah, they're going to try to not certify the election around the country. But this is one of the things that the Democratic Party is 100% prepared for. There are a team of lawyers in every county where they might do that are immediately there. You know more about this than I do, but I think it's injunctions that they file. And the state courts look really well upon preserving the voting process. Maybe not the Supreme Court, but the state courts do.
And I've made the point that, in the swing states, Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Georgia, Arizona, Nevada, North Carolina, in like 5 of those states, the swing states from last time, like 4 of those 5 swing states, they have a Democratic governor, a Democratic Secretary of State, a Democratic Attorney General. And Nevada, they have a Republican governor, but all the other offices are Democrat.
Yeah. And they've already sent out those letters.
Yeah, exactly.
If you screw around with the election, you're going to jail.
And in Georgia, all of those offices are Republicans, but it's Brian Kemp as governor, Brad Raffensperger as Secretary of State, and they refused to help Trump last time in 2020.
Right.
And Trump is going to be in Georgia. He's in Georgia either today or tomorrow, and Brian Kemp and Brad Raffensperger are not attending that event.
There you go. Says all you need to know. I'm going to tell you this. Yeah. Especially because I've talked to a lot of people in Texas and Houston. The most positive thing that had the biggest impact, TikTok creators like you that have really large followings. I'm sitting down here with the peasants at 29,000 or something like that. But the big creators like you that went out there every day and said, check your voter registration and get yourself registered if you're not registered, you will never know the positive impact that had on on states like Texas, et cetera, because I'm telling you, there were hundreds of thousands of voters that heard that on social media, went out and checked,
Wow.
found out their registration had been dumped, and got their registration back in again before the deadline.
Wow.
Yeah.
Man.
True fact.
All right. So let's close it out with this. Does Kamala Harris win Nevada?
Yes.
Does she win Arizona?
No.
I agree with you on that. Michigan?
Yes. Although
Wisconsin?
I'm more worried about Michigan than I am Pennsylvania, to be honest with you.
Because of large Muslim population?
Well, that is just tight. It's tight.
Yeah.
Although in the early
Okay.
voting, African Americans are voting at a 3.5% higher rate, which I think bodes well. But
Excellent.
yeah, I think she'll win Michigan. Yeah.
Wisconsin?
Yes.
Georgia?
No.
I agree with you on that. North Carolina?
All right, this is the first big one. It's time to shit or get off the pot. I'm going to say yes.
Okay. Because same number of electoral count votes as Georgia.
That's right. That's right.
And I've seen a lot of TikToks from people on the ground. I've read a lot of articles about the demographics and the changing demographics in North Carolina, and their urban areas have been growing pretty dramatically over the last several years.
Yeah. If she, I think she's going to win it, and if she doesn't, I think it will be the closest state.
Interesting. All right, now the big one, Pennsylvania.
Yes, I think she's going to win Pennsylvania, and therefore I do think she will be president. Now, I have to caveat this the way I caveat everything is how much of my opinion on this is jaded in the belief that I want to believe we live in a certain type of country.
No doubt, man.
And how much of this, I still want to believe that when older white women go in to vote, they're going to vote for Harris's world and her worldview and not Trump's. But I will say this, I'm not leaving. I'm going to stay and I'm going to fight if he does win.
Me too.
And there's a lot of work to do either way. But if you press me and you say pick a side, I think she's going to win.
I've looked at a whole bunch of polling that basically is putting at like 70 to 72% the support of white men for Donald Trump.
Yeah.
Is that I mean, and I'm just like, what a bunch of petulant little
it's ridiculous.
Little bitches, man.
It's ridiculous.
They're voting against the rights of every single woman in their life because their feelings have been hurt, because they feel like society didn't give them what they were owed. It's just disgusting, man.
You hear it all the time, Hawk. How many times have you heard when you go on a live? I mean, I did a live the other night, and there were 3 women on there in tears because they're in abusive relationships with MAGA husbands. And the thing is, they didn't get abusive until Trump came along, and they disagreed with him about Trump. I'm not saying these people weren't. I'm not saying they already didn't have the propensity to be violent in their nature, but that was the trigger. That's what set it off. And every time I do a live, I hear it. We're going to find out on Election Day. A lot of these questions are going to be answered on Election Day. And if we do live in that other country, where Harris loses, then we've all got tough decisions that we need to make. Are we going to throw our hands up in the air, or are we going to continue to fight? And I hope everybody says we're going to fight.
I know my brother will.
Amen.
All right, so last question. So in 2020, Election Day was obviously on Tuesday. They didn't call the election until that Saturday morning. I was down in LA at my ex-girlfriend's sister's house. And I'll never forget that Saturday morning. That's when Rudy Giuliani was holding his press conference at Four Seasons Landscaping. When CNN broke into his bullshit press conference to declare that Joe Biden had won the election. So it took from Tuesday night to Saturday morning. What kind of time frame do you think we're looking at this year?
It will take a couple of days, but I think we'll get it a little bit earlier, maybe Thursday or Friday, only because there's not going to be as much early vote. A lot of it's going to
Okay.
happen on election day. So, and I think you're actually going to. One thing I'll give like Kornacki credit for is I do think he'll be able to look at the same day election numbers. And for instance, like I said, in Pennsylvania, if we know we've got a 350 to 400,000 firewall built up there, and on election day, the Republicans are only running what looks to be like 100,000, 150,000 vote lead, we're going to win Pennsylvania. I don't need to see all the votes to know that. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does.
Yeah.
Yes, it does. All right, man. We're exactly at 1 hour. I want to thank you again so much for doing this.
Hopefully I wasn't too boring.
Dude, for me, that was a super interesting conversation, which I think says quite a bit about me.
No, me too.
All right, man. Thanks again for doing this.
You bet.
I appreciate all of your knowledge, experience, and insight. And thanks everybody for subscribing and for listening. And 1 week to go.
1 week to go.
We'll see you guys soon.